Hello and good evening from here in Dhaka, Bangladesh. My name is Saqib Haq. I'm from the International Center for Climate Change and Development. Today we have a very exciting session, and that's being broadcasted in many different time zones, and many of our speakers will be joining from their various different time zones. So very grateful for the late nights and early mornings wherever you may be coming in from. So what we would have called this session is Unpacking the FRLD, which is a very technical acronym, which stands for the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. For those of you that don't follow the negotiations or are not in the nitty-gritty of quite a lot of the international forum, you would know that the loss and damage topic under the UNFCCC Convention has established a fund for responding to the impacts that are being caused by climate impacts and are not being addressed by adaptation or resilience and are being tackled by loss and damage elements that we are not able to adapt from. So this board has just recently concluded their 5th meeting. It's been set up as a secretariat, and they've concluded their 5th meeting. And today, what we would like to do is talk with some of the people that have been following this negotiations before the board was established, when it was just a thematic area of loss and damage, looking at what the impacts are, how they're manifesting them. And then as the board has been created and set up into their meeting structures, and hopefully working into dispersing funding down to frontline communities, which are part of the discussions and deliberations of the board. What are those implications and what do these meetings mean? What are the decisions that come through? And then what are activities that frontline communities, civil societies, and activists and academics like ourselves, what are the ways that we can engage with these activities? What do these decisions mean for the work that we're doing on the ground? And to hear from them, what are the different things that we should be looking out for in raising the voice for these frontline communities to these board meetings, which are a very critical element that we find is missing oftentimes at the international forums. So I have here my esteemed speakers and hoping to have a couple of our others join us in the course of our session. So thank you all for joining us. I'll give a brief introduction as the speakers are online here. So we have Dr. Christopher Bartlett, who's the head of climate diplomacy from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs from the government of Vanuatu, and a longtime veteran climate negotiator. We have Mr. Harjeet Singh, the founding director of Sattat Sampada Climate Foundation, and the global engagement director for fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiatives. And we have Advocate Mohammed Hafizul Islam Khan, who's the executive director for Center for Climate Justice Bangladesh, CCJB, and a member of the WIM ExCom. So I will stop sharing so that we can move on to our remarks. What I would like to do is to call upon our speakers to give us a few of the key critical elements that was discussed at the board meeting. And please do bear in mind that quite a lot of the audience might not be familiar with the technical jargons. So if there are elements that you have gone through, please try to break it down so that it's open to a wider audience. If there are any questions from our audience and our people that are following us online, please do feel free to put them in the chat, put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to address them at the end of our remarks here today. But Hafiz Bhai, if you'd like to come with the remarks from the board meeting, please.
Thank you, Saqib. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to recall Professor Salim and his great contribution to establishment of this loss and damage fund. That is, we named Fund for Responding Loss and Damage. So, and also I do appreciate ICCCAD to organize this event, which is very timely because we need to be aware of the outcomes of every fund board meeting so that we can take necessary actions at the national level. So Ambassador Adao, who is a board member from the least developing countries to the fund board, he's supposed to deliver the key outcomes from the board 5th board meeting for the loss and damage fund. So colleagues, I will use both of the words actually, fund for responding loss and damage, but easily that is still we call it loss and damage fund. That makes our life easier. So Saqib, you're right. Maybe we need to use some sort of jargon, which is for the new listeners would be difficult, but still we'll try to maintain the consequences so that we do understand. As Saqib talked about the establishment of the fund, now the 26 members board are working to develop further modalities to operationalize this fund. Colleagues, unfortunately, the board is still working to operationalize this fund, particularly fifth board meeting that was held in the first week of April in Barbados. It was really fruitful because I'm happy to share with you all that is we agreed for a startup phase, which is very important. It means we started up. So in the startup phase, to implement the startup phase, we also agreed for modalities that we named the Barbados implementation modalities. So if we look at the key issues involved with the startup phase and also the implementation modalities, in the startup phase, we have taken a fundamental principle is that we would like to test and refine the modalities to develop our longer term strategies. Since it's a startup phase, it should be short term and mostly experimental. The lesson learned from this experimental phase, we can develop the longer term strategies. So what are the key issues we agreed at B5? Particularly, we agreed the minimum percentage from the floor. That is important key outcomes from this meeting, I would say. We agreed for 50%, even qualified to achieve the goal. So subject to achievement to the goal, but fundamentally we agreed 50% goes to the LDCs and seats, because we all know that LDCs and seats are the most vulnerable to the climate change. Then we agreed that at the startup phase, the countries can request for any activities, projects and programs, and they can request for $5 to $20 million. I know it's peanuts for if we compare with our demands, but still I would appreciate that we can start with these small grants, which can be really helpful to prepare the countries to develop their national processes, systems, national mechanisms, so that they can access these financial resources would be provided by this fund. At the same time, I'm sure Christopher will highlight the challenges that also came out from the fourth advisory board meeting from the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. Colleagues, at this stage, you see this loss and damage fund cannot work silo, because you need to ensure the coherence, complementarity, synergies with the Santiago Network that aims to catalyze the technical assistance. And we all know that there is an executive committee under the Warsaw International Mechanism, which is working for last 10 years in collaboration with 5 expert groups, including the task force on displacement. So you see the 3 different working streams, I would say, but there are 3 constituted bodies under the UNFCCCs are working. So main challenge is the coherence, coordination, and synergies. We all know that in 25th April, we had the first high-level dialogue where we looked at the different stakeholders from the different funding entities, funding arrangement. They also highlighted the importance of complementarity and coherence. So within the UNFCCC, at the same time, outside of the convention or UNFCCC, there are funding arrangements. So now the priority is the synergies, coordination. So how to do it? We all know that Warsaw International Mechanism was established, it is now more than a decade. Now we are trying to conduct the 3rd review, which we failed. That's supposed to be held at COP29. But next is B62 an opportunity. We can start the review process of the Warsaw International Mechanism, how it can ensure the coordination among all these entities who are involved for the financing for loss and damage. With that said, I would also would like to highlight some of the points that is, this is the time to prepare ourselves, vulnerable countries, least developing countries, seats. We need to prepare ourselves. We need to develop easy access modalities, because we agreed in the governing instrument for this loss and damage fund for direct budget support. Very simple provision or clause we agreed. We cannot go beyond that. Colleagues, this is not the green fund or other funding entities that we need to develop the project, we need to submit, the project will be evaluated, then it will be awarded, implemented. That is not the case. Here we are asking for the direct budget support. Then how to ensure the direct budget support? Then we need to prepare or designate the national authority. That is also part of the Barbados implementation modalities. That decision requested national government to appoint the national authorities or the focal points. So that would be very startup for the preparedness at the national level. We need to appoint the focal point, designated authority, and we need to look at our existing mechanisms, and we need to identify the loopholes in institutional structure. We need to design an institutional structure so that immediately any countries can respond the call. After 6th board meeting, we are hoping the fund will call for a fund request, and by this time we can prepare ourselves, and end of the year we can access the resources from this fund so that we can also share our stories at COP30. So this is my looking forward thoughts. We need to take preparation at the national level, also at the board level. At board 6, we need to agree for the modalities so that we can try to disburse the fund soon after the 6th board meeting. So I would like to stop here. Colleagues, since I'm acting as an advisor to Ambassador Adao, once again, apologies for him because he is committed for a state event, but I think I tried to cover some of the views that's supposed to be shared with the Adao. Thank you. Saki, over to you.
Thank you, Afij bhai, and it's a shame we couldn't have Ambassador Adao with us, but please give him our regards. And also thank you for explaining and going through a lot of the sort of technical elements, in particular, the fact that there are at the international forum that there are 3 sort of entities that really look at addressing loss and damage at the negotiation. So as you mentioned, we're looking at the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, which is one of the elements, which is the financing pillar. Hafij Bhai is also a member of the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee. So you'll hear the acronym for WIM-EXCOM in quite a lot of the policy areas, which is really the negotiations sort of segment that looks into the policy of how to address loss and damage at the negotiations as a treaty. And then there's the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage, which is the SNLD, where we're looking at a broader network of observers and experts being able to sort of dissect and look at the thematic areas of loss and damage and really how it's manifesting in communities, and what do national entities and national organizations and governments really need to be doing in sort of understanding how loss and damage is playing out and manifesting in their own countries, in their context, and develop the appropriate strategies and what kind of technical support they need for that. So with that little segue, I'll maybe move on to Dr. Christopher Bartlett from Vanuatu. Christopher, maybe if you can, in your remarks of giving us a few of the key decisions from the board meeting, as well as some of the Santiago networks activities that you're engaged with. What are the ways that these sort of interlink and how we might be able to sort of plan ahead, going ahead from the activities that you're doing? And as this is a global platform, what might be some good lessons for other countries to also look into? Christopher, perhaps over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Saqib, and thanks also to ICCCAD and the organizers of the conference. I think this is a very important discussion for the public, the citizens of the world, to understand where we are and where we've come from when it comes to this crisis of climate change and the loss and damage that's resulted. I am going to start my comments actually with a comment that Hafish made, that we hope that by the end of this year, we'll start to see resources flowing to address loss and damage. And what that says to me and to so many of us is that there are not yet resources flowing to address loss and damage. Now, we have been fighting this fight for now 34 years. Way back in 1991, when countries were first discussing a treaty on climate change, Vanuatu and the EOSIS group made a proposal that loss and damage should be a fundamental pillar of the convention. We made a proposal that there should be a fund to compensate the victims of sea level rise in small island developing states. Obviously, that didn't happen. Years and years went by that our partners on the other side of the room deferred and denied and delayed until finally we got something called the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage. And we thought, okay, now we're going to see the action that's required to address the impacts, not try to minimize risk or try to reduce global greenhouse gas emissions, which wasn't happening, but actually help people who were suffering from climate change. But what we found was that the Warsaw International Mechanism and its executive committee did everything but actually mobilize resources to help people. And this is why we brought again to the COP process this fight that we needed a financing facility. We didn't get it. At COP25, we got something called the Santiago Network on Loss and Damage, which is a technical assistance facility, not money, TA. But I have to say that even today, after COP25, so we're now 5 years after that decision to set up the Santiago Network, no technical assistance has yet flowed to a single developing country. And Vanuatu was the first country to request for the TA. It hasn't arrived to us yet. And so here we are now. We've just gone through the 5th board meeting of the new fund for responding to loss and damage. And this fund was set up at COP27. We had the governing instrument, the operationalization at COP28, and they claimed last COP that it's now open for business. But as I said, not a single penny has flowed to a developing country to address loss and damage. And so what we did, as Hafish took you through, was to really talk about how we can get money out the door as soon as possible. And you would have heard the SIDS board members and the least developed country board members making it abundantly clear that we cannot delay any further to support vulnerable people everywhere around the world, but in particularly vulnerable developing countries to receive resources. So I suppose from my perspective, the big win from the 5th board meeting was the establishment of the Barbados implementation modality, which Hafish took us through. And essentially what this does is it says we commit to spending the money that we have in the kitty right now in the next 2 years to get out the door. And while we didn't yet agree on who the money is going to go to exactly, or what the criteria will be for getting the money, we at least agreed that there is a pot of money of $250 million US, which will be allocated in grants, not loans or any other modality, in grants to particularly vulnerable developing countries of between 5 million and 20 million US apiece. We also made it very clear that this money should go to the most vulnerable. And as Hafish mentioned, we have this floor of 50% of the money or more should be going to the small island developing states or the LDC. So this was a big win. And I should say that it wasn't without debate and without dissension. Sadly, this board has not yet found its feet in operating like a board, in trying to make decisions, good decisions as a collective. It still feels a bit like the UNFCCC COP process, where you have the developed versus the developing. And in some cases, developing versus developing, when it gets to tricky issues like who should get the money and allocation floors. So I feel that we're still finding our feet. That said, there has been good progress. So I think what was pretty exciting about the Barbados implementation modality is that it is designed to really test some of the innovation. We want to, first of all, make sure that we're seeing bottom-up, country-led and country-owned approaches to addressing loss and damage. Now, this is very different to how the GCF operates, for example, that accredited entities supposedly work with countries and develop programs and proposals that are widely supported and consulted on, and then those monies flow directly to vulnerable communities, which is not always the case with the GCF, the Adaptation Fund, or the JEF. So this approach for the BIM, as it's called, the Barbados Implementation Modalities, is to make sure that we're strengthening those national responses that Hafish talked about, and to make sure that any request to the board is based on widespread engagement of stakeholders, in particular, people and communities and indigenous people, civil society, private sector, who really do make up what we call the whole of society approach to addressing loss and damage. I think what's also exciting that came out of this particular decision is the fact that we can use a variety of ways to get that money to us. While, of course, our preferred modality is to receive the money directly from the fund, directly from the trust account at the World Bank into our national treasury or our national trust fund or our national system. Right now, that modality is still being worked through. The World Bank can't yet, apparently, give us the money directly. And so in this decision, it was decided that we could use a range of entities that have already been screened or scrutinized by the other funds. So if you're accredited, for example, to the GCF, to the Adaptation Fund, to the GEF, then this may make you eligible to be the path through to get to the country. The decision also states that we can use national entities where they exist. So if there's a nationally accredited entity already, while in the Pacific, we only have a few, none in Vanuatu, we could use them. We could also use the multilateral development banks or the UN agencies, but we are going to be working right away. And in fact, we're expecting the Secretariat to give us a proposal at the next meeting on how this direct access through budget support modality could work. And what's very important for us during this BIM phase, this early startup phase, which is the 2-year phase, is that we're actually trialing modalities that get direct access to people. So it's not about governments taking money only through their treasuries and spending the money only through government systems, but it's about using all disbursement modalities, including through civil society, including direct access through cash transfer, including perhaps payment of insurance premiums for vulnerable farmers and fishermen that are affected by climate impact. So we're really looking to innovate. And that's what the board is looking forward to. At the next meeting, we've given a mandate to the Secretariat of the fund to come back to us with essentially a proposal for the requests. What are the funding criteria? What are the results management systems? And what does the template look like? How can a country actually request money from the fund? None of that exists yet, and that will be discussed and hopefully approved. And then the call for proposals or the call for requests would be open after the next board meeting, B6, certainly by the end of this year, with money hopefully flowing out the door as soon as possible. Now, I also very quickly wanted to mention the money. So as you know, this fund is open right now for donations and contributions, but very sadly, the money has not been flowing at the scale that is needed. Right now, within the fund, 768 million US dollars has been pledged. Now, first of all, that 708 million really truly is peanuts when you look at the costs that countries, the developing world, people around the planet are burdened with because of the impacts of climate change that are beyond the limits of adaptation. I mean, some estimates are, between 500 billion US dollars per year, the costs of loss and damage up to trillions. And it's only getting worse with every ton of carbon dioxide that continues to expand in the atmosphere. So there have been signed agreements for around 495 million US dollars, but the actual amount that's been paid into the trust so far is only 320 million. So what can you do with such a small amount of money that has actually been put into the trust account? And that's why this BIM decision had to limit the amount of money that's going to be available for developing countries by the end of this year. We originally wanted to say, look, let's use 300 million right away, but we're not sure we're even going to get those payments in. There are several countries which have not yet signed an agreement and certainly haven't paid their pledge amount. So we just don't know how this fund is going to swell or not, or if this is just going to be an empty shell with a lot of talk and no money. So these are some of the real issues that we faced at the board meeting. I did mention, of course, that there were some tensions within the board. We heard that the Secretariat is planning to expand its technical capacity. Right now, there really isn't a secretariat except for a very few people. Of course, the executive director has been hired, but no one to actually implement the decisions of the board. And that's why they're depending on this interim secretariat, which is made up of several agencies that are doing their best to help. But what we really need, and which wasn't decided yet, is a rapid mobilization of human resources. We want to see consultants hired. We want to see technical experts in non-economic losses and damages and slow onset events and innovative finance and direct access by communities. And it doesn't look like that's happening fast enough. And if we're going to be able to get money out the door, we are absolutely going to need to upscale the human resource capacity of our secretariat. I might also say that Vanuatu is very privileged to be on a rotating board seat. So the SIDS have certain allocated seats, and our Pacific SIDS have decided that we're going to share a one-year rotation among Fiji, the Cook Islands, and Vanuatu. So Fiji has done an outstanding job for the first year of the board. Soon we'll be rotating then into Cook Islands and Vanuatu. So I'm very much looking forward to be sitting on the board right now, advising Fiji, but very soon sitting on the board and hoping to push as much as possible that we do better and don't allow the 34 years that we've been waiting and fighting and pushing to have gone to waste. So with that, I'll pause. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. I think that was a excellent rundown of a lot of the key decisions, and in fact, quite a lot of the elements that I wanted to pick up on the second segment as well. So then those are some of the critical questions that I will be coming back to for all our speakers, in particular, the issue that you picked about of funding. So again, this is a very, very crucial element that we've seen in terms of the fund already being established with very low level of pledges, many of which have not also come through, as you quite rightly mentioned. But then again, that's also part of what we're trying to unpack with the discussions and dialogue such as this about how we can advocate for that type of funding pledges to be actualized, to actually be put into the trust fund of the fund, and then dispersed, not only sitting into the trust funds, but actually funding agreements going to countries, going to vulnerable communities. And that's something that we would like to do, is as we unpack some of the key decisions, but then what are the ways that we can advocate for more ambition to come through. So in that stead, I'll segue to Harjeet, who has been fighting the long fight of trying to get more advocacy and ambition built into loss and damage. And quite rightly, I remember the protests that you have, and hopefully perhaps even in this intersessional in Bonn at SB 62, perhaps a few more protests that happen in the corridors. Again, what are some of the key things from the messages that civil societies and activists and academics really can take from this board meeting, Harjeet? And then in the next segment, what are some of the things that we will be gearing up for going ahead? To you, Harjeet, please.
Thank you very much, Saqib. As Christopher said, this is such an important conversation. And after fighting this fight for 34 long years, this is the time when we have got a fund and we need to make sure that it's fit for purpose. I'm not going to repeat, but just to stress on what Hafiz Bhai and Christopher shared. I think from civil society perspective, of course, we are very aligned with developing countries, and we are also going to focus much more on how now that money is going to be channeled. From our perspective, as we keep saying, and also for making it easy for people to remember, there are three broader issues: scale, speed, and access. We can't keep our eyes off that. And so scale, as Christopher said, it's a drop in the ocean. We need hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And we need to make sure that, as Hafiz was saying, this startup phase, this Barbados implementation modalities, BIM, should be able to demonstrate, on one hand, what's working, what needs to be scaled up, and how we are going to set up a system which can actually help scale up. And that's important. And that's the concern of developing countries has been, that let's not look at this fund as just another fund which is channeling just a couple of millions of dollars. That's not the reason we fought so hard for. We need to make sure that we are able to meet the needs of communities and countries on ground. And that's why it's important to keep talking about scale. And we will speak in the next segment how we should focus on the resource mobilization strategy and how civil society should really come together and working alongside developing countries to really take up that scale part. Now, whatever has been pledged as part of BIM, which is also going to happen alongside many of the systems that the Secretariat is going to develop. You know, whether we talk about the trigger mechanism, we haven't really talked enough about how it's going to be connected with the funding request, the results framework, accredited agencies that Christopher and Hafiz alluded to. We as civil society have a huge concern. We don't want it to happen in wholesale, because there are many accredited organizations and private sector companies and banks who are accredited, who are not relevant for loss and damage fund. And if we just do a copy paste without filtering them, and I would say weeding them out, we are going to give a lot of space to the private sector to take away money. In fact, there are some organizations who are responsible for the crisis. There are many banks who continue to fund fossil fuels. So we need to look at how we apply a filter when it comes to accredited agencies. Yes, we need to so-called grandfather or grandmother those agencies for the sake of speed. But again, we need to be very mindful of who we are going to involve as we start implementing. Now, similarly, role of civil society, the observer participation related policies have not been concluded, which are going to come up over the next 2 board meetings. Hopefully, it gets decided next at the next one. There also, private sector seat has been mentioned in the draft document, which is something we are very, very concerned about. And especially how we define private sector. So there are a number of challenges related to the private sector, which has not played a constructive role so far, even in adaptation financing. Forget about loss and damage. So those are things that we are highlighting very, very strongly as civil society. Now, coming to speed, again, as Christopher mentioned, the reason we got World Bank and, with all the pain and saying that, yes, okay, by working with an existing institution with all its historical challenges, we may be able to, get it faster. Look at where we are. We haven't yet been able to channel money to developing countries. Good that we have got this BIM approved, yet we are still not having the full systems in place to make sure that money reaches to them sooner. So the speed is still and then the speed is also going to be linked with what's going to come up as part of policies and processes by the Secretariat, which is going to be presented next time in the next board meeting on those processes. Very important, and that's what we will be engaging with. The third part is access. Now, access is much broader. We have been fighting this fight shoulder to shoulder with developing countries that direct access is an utmost priority. Money should go to countries directly as part of the budgetary support. Then it has to be programmatic. Alongside, we are saying we need to make sure that community access is equally important. We too recognize that a large reconstruction work is going to be led by government, but that doesn't mean that communities cannot be involved. In fact, what we want communities to be at the center of recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. And that can be done in many ways by integrating indirect access in the programmatic approach and setting up the small grants program alongside. Now, that has been deferred, which is something that we are not happy with and which we have been pushing for a long time. And I understand the reason behind it, but because developing countries wanted to prioritize direct access. And we are with them on this fight, as I mentioned, but we need to make sure that communities continue to play an important role. We always know they are the first responders, and they should be taking charge of the recovery and rehabilitation work. So that's a core thing which has been pushed back, and I would urge Christopher, Hafiz, and all our friends on the board as advisors, as alternate, to really make sure that this remains a priority with the existing strands of work that are part of BIM, but also setting up the small grants program. So, and of course, we are going to be working on the elements of transparency and accountability and so on. So let me take a pause because we'll be covering in the next section. Over to you, Sakib.
Thank you, Harjeet. I didn't want to break you in the flow of it, but it's also quite good. I think that you've covered quite a few areas that we might be looking at in terms of mobilizing communities. What are the things that from national governments, quite a lot of us that don't engage at the international forums, we see the crowds getting larger and larger at FSBs and the COPs, but that's still not everybody that's back home and actually working on these issues. And there's quite a lot of way that we really need to be mobilizing everybody, as Christopher mentioned, in a whole of society approach. What are the takeaways that we at home really should be gearing up for? And then the select few of us that are at these negotiations, really putting them in the rooms in the negotiations, putting them in the text where it's necessary. So I'll open the chat box for our colleagues in the audience if there are any questions, if anybody would like to raise their hand or put it in the panel. In the meantime, I'll abuse my role as a moderator and throw in a question of my own. So as we see in the board meetings, you quite rightly mentioned that the funding amount is not sufficient and the speed at it is not sufficient. Is there any appetite at the board level, perhaps from any of the developing or least developed countries, to think about complementarity between the funds? So the UNFCCC, the Fund for Loss and Damage, is not the only entity and the only access, but they do have other, the GCF fund, for one example, the Adaptation Fund, as well as non-UNFCCC funds that have been used to address climate action. So is there any sort of openness in the board to sort of look at, in the meantime, as this takes in more pledges, as this gains a little bit of momentum, for the fund for responding to loss and damage being complementary, to work with some of the other funds, perhaps take some of their proposals and use that as pilots to implement, or vice versa, take proposals on behalf of other funds and then submit them to that? Is there any sort of appetite? Is that something that might be something that we could petition for, or is that something that is a non-starter to begin with? Open floor, anybody want to jump in?
Christopher, you're muted. Go ahead, please. I'll compliment if required.
Sure, I'll take a first stab. So I might start from the bottom-up perspective and what Vanuatu's intentions are in terms of the resources from this fund. So for a long time, the Pacific SIDS have been talking about programmatic approaches. And the idea behind a programmatic approach is twofold. First of all, we recognize that no amount of money from this fund will be sufficient to address the impacts that we're facing, existential impacts that our communities are facing. And so a programmatic approach allows us to think laterally across different sources of finance, whether it's bilateral finance that we're getting from our closest partners, whether it's multilateral development bank finance, including loans that we're getting for rehabilitating infrastructure and other things, whether it's from philanthropies, whether it's small grants programs that exist. So really looking across the board at finance available for loss and damage and putting it into a coherent strategy for the nation. And we feel like this is the right way to begin to leverage funds from across the funding arrangements that we keep hearing so much about. But what's so important is that this fund has to be the beating heart of that programmatic approach, because nothing will work unless you can get real investment at scale. And I'm sorry to use the word investment, finance at scale, which doesn't bring economic benefit or economic derivative, but is truly a response to the harm that's been caused by others' actions. So that has to be the heart of the programmatic approach. The other benefit of the programmatic approach is that it allows countries to be truly flexible in addressing the needs of vulnerable people. So rather than saying we're going to do a project which has a certain log frame and certain activities, the programmatic approach really allows us to tailor the activities based on emerging and evolving needs. So we would expect that these programmatic approaches would be longer term than a 2 or 3 year project, and that they would include a whole range of sectors and actors at all levels, right from our communities, our community disaster and climate change committees actions, right up to national government and regional activities. So that's why we think the programmatic approach is how we are going to utilize the first resources from the fund. And in fact, what we've done to create a programmatic approach and a programmatic request is to request technical assistance from the Santiago Network. So our request was very specifically, come to help us design a loss and damage program that can be submitted to the fund for responding to loss and damage. And so that technical assistance, as I mentioned in my first intervention, hasn't yet been delivered. We're hoping that in the next weeks that will start. And we aim then to have this request, which is programmatic, long-term, country-driven, using national systems and all modalities for communities, direct access on our businesses, to the board during this first call for proposals. So that's kind of a bottom-up strategy about we're hoping to nationally lead on complementarity and coherence.
Arjit, anything to complement?
A lot has been covered by Christopher, not much to add. I think the participants may know that there was a high-level dialogue on 25th of April, and we haven't heard back what really happened because they did not do the live streaming. So we would love to know. And that was exactly about complementarity and coherence. But just to underline, we as civil society also have the same position that loss and damage fund, FRLD, has to be at the very core, or as Christopher said, a beating heart of all the fund and funding arrangement. That has to be ensured. And then of course, we should seek money from all different sources and ensure complementarity. So that's really important. And one more thing I must also highlight, that while we need to keep our eyes and engagement at the international level, a lot more effort now needs to be done at the national level. So all these conversations, Saqib, that we are doing here, and the work that ICCCAD does and many other organizations, and we need to really start working with countries. Look at Santiago Network. We do not have a good pipeline of requests for even technical support. Vanuatu has been a champion, has put something out there, but we need a lot more of that. Similarly, with this fund, we should not wait for the Secretariat to come up with their own now design by B6 in July. We should start working on that right now and then adjust based on what template is going to, or process is going to be agreed upon. So really, we need to make sure now countries who have worked with us and fought with us to get this fund and the Santiago Network, let's now capitalize on it. Let's now start making this fund operational by accessing money and support that we demanded.
Good words. Maybe as I throw the mic to Hafiz Bhai, you can also allude a little bit about some of the national perspectives from Bangladesh, because I know you're quite embedded with the ministry here, where they've taken on how to sort of tackle the issue of loss and damage from the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change here. Hafiz Bhai?
Thanks, Saqib, because Christopher and Harjit, both of them highlighted the importance of national preparedness so that we can develop national processes, national systems, national mechanisms so that we can access. This is the time, access, and access. We need to access the technical guidance from the EXCOM of the Washington International Mechanism. We need to access the technical assistance from the Santiago Network. And we need to access the financial resources from the Loss and Damage Fund. At the same time, we also need to access technical and financial resources. Those are available beyond the convention in the so-called funding arrangement. So it's not so easy, particularly Cs and LDCs. We don't have the capacities to prepare ourselves. But this time we need to take the challenge because assistance are there even for the preparedness assistance. Santiago Network can support us. And I already talked about the first phase that is also aiming to support the countries to develop their preparedness mechanisms. So this is the time, and Bangladesh, for example, Bangladesh government also is trying to develop a national framework. And so far, I know Timor-Leste government also is trying to develop a national mechanism, some sort of like this for under the preparedness context. So in Bangladesh, ICCCAD also has taken a nice initiative, that is they would like to support government to develop a comprehensive national mechanism. So this is, I think, very timely effort. And ICCCAD is trying to work with the Ministry of Environment and Forest here in Bangladesh so that not only complementary at the global level. I always do highlight the importance of multi-actor partnership also at the national level. National level, we cannot take the silo approach. There is a need for GEO, NGO, and other stakeholder cooperation and collaboration. For example, what ICCCAD is trying to develop a national mechanism, government is trying to develop a framework. We can combine the ideas, and GEO, NGOs, and other partners, we can act together, because end of the day, we would like to be benefited at the national level with our right preparedness. So I would like to stop here. So the three words, access, and access, but we need the preparations. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz Bhai. I think that is a very succinct way of putting in what are the next steps that we should be focusing on. And thank you again for highlighting some of our collaborations, both with CCJB as well as ICCCAD with the government of Bangladesh. So quite rightly, there are a number of initiatives where we're looking at how to really bring that community access into the national forum. So again, there are a number of examples from LDCs, particularly Bangladesh as well, where we have looked at how do we be more inclusive with communities and individuals, how networks and associations can really bring forward their thoughts and views in terms of challenges that they're facing, the impacts that they're facing, and research organizations like ourselves trying to really document that as evidences that can be put into policy making. But there are definitely ways that we could be better and enlarge that, be more inclusive in the ways, and not only just as a sort of stakeholder group networking, talking about the issues, but really in decision making. And I think that's one of the things that we're very excited about in this loss and damage framework activity that Hafiz Bhai mentioned, in being able to really use these community groups and these sort of platforms to really allow community members to have that power of decision making about what sort of interventions, innovations need to be put in, what worked before, and then really using communities to try and evaluate and help in making these projects be more sustainable and successful going forward. So again, thank you so much for highlighting some national steps that we could be taking. And again, through our Gobeshona platform, happy to be sharing that. If there are other initiatives and other persons that are on the call that are looking for examples, happy to have that call and happy to share what are the experiences, as I'm sure our panelists would, of their activities in their countries and their foundations. So please do feel free to ask questions if you have any, or reach out to us after the conference. So I still don't see anything coming from the crowd, so I'll abuse my power once more. As you quite rightly mentioned that, we have highlighted the severity of the challenges. So again, one of the statistics that Hafiz Bhai and I have been working on with the government here, just last year of 2024, looking at just one element of climate impacts, if we look at extreme flooding in Bangladesh, there is an estimate that the government of Bangladesh Department of Environment have of the top 4 or 5 extreme flooding events that happened just in 1 year in Bangladesh, and a rough estimate of the number of damages that has come through. And that is already in the billions. That's looking only at one climate impact of extreme flooding, not looking at any other, not the cyclones, not the heat waves, not any other impacts that can come through. And again, only looking at the extremes. So not even the low level flooding that have come through, but only at the top 4 or 5 that have crossed thresholds, either in severity or in the geography that it has impacted. So again, if one country is going to be impacted in the $1.5 billion range from one impact, and we're looking at a global fund that is barely in the billions in itself, strategically, what would be the better way for us to really sort of think about using the fund as a technical assistance provider, or allowing us to have our own national system set up, or use this as a response for some of these humanitarian issues that are going to be coming through? What might be the better way while we sort of strategically look forward, how to engage with this fund? We know it comes through a budget support, but as you quite rightly mentioned in some of the remarks, that budget support doesn't mean that it should be embedded and just stay in the government entities. It needs to be sort of devolved further. So strategically, what are some of the things that national systems really need to look forward to in unpacking here? Right now, a lot of the LDCs and SIDS don't have that infrastructure built in. What should we be doing in our countries to make that infrastructure happen? Again, open floor, maybe Hafiz Bhai, I see you unmuted. So if you want to jump in, and then we'll allow Christopher and Hardik to come in.
Okay, actually, I was not unmuted to speak. Anyway, Sakib, thank you. Yes, I was taking a note. Recently, we conducted a study where we tried to look at tried to understand the community needs. So while we tried to understand the community needs, we found that the budget, the national government are allocating funds for the Ministry of Disaster Management, Ministry of Environment, particularly to address the climate change and impacts and vulnerability, is very small, which is not demand driven. So our budgetary system needs to be developed, framework that can ensure the demand driven budget allocation. So for example, if we can access some resources from the Fund for Responding Loss and Damage as direct budget support, but we need to ensure those budgets are allocated to relevant ministries based on the demands or with the transparency framework. Colleagues, we do see at the board level discussion, some of the board members from the developed countries, they are really keen about the transparency and monitoring issues. Even we raise as LDCs or CIS, we don't have the capacities to develop such transparency framework or rigorous monitoring framework. But reality is that we need to ensure the transparency, at least very systematic processes at the national level, so that we can demand based on our communities. As Christopher said, it is not only the trigger based, it is also programmatic approach, we need to develop short-term, mid-term, long-term programs so that we can communicate those programs and we can get the direct budget support against the program, including the trigger-based approaches. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz Bhai. Christopher?
Yeah, I'll hop in here specifically about what countries and what communities and what institutions in developing countries need to be doing now. So we know that money's coming. We can't be complacent. We have to be extremely proactive, starting, in my opinion, with a comprehensive discussion about what loss and damage means to us. How is this distinct to adaptation? How is it distinct to humanitarian support? How is it distinct to disaster risk reduction? And in my experience, these conversations are not yet being had. We love to talk about loss and damage as the third pillar of the Paris Agreement, but unfortunately, it seems to be a bit of the third wheel. People aren't investing the intellectual rigor that's required to really, truly articulate what it means to an individual who's suffering from impacts and then trying to do something about it. So that would be my first suggestion, is have those national whole of society conversations about, for you, what are the priorities for loss and damage? What are actions that you could quantify or qualify as being loss and damage actions? So Vanuatu had this discussion over the last year, and we've created a national policy on loss and damage, and I would love for you, all of you, to have a look at it, to give you ideas about at least what we're thinking. We've created a typology of activities that we, in our view, see as loss and damage activities, distinct to the other types of climate activities that you could take. And once you've got the boundaries around what loss and damage is, then it becomes a lot easier to think about, well, how can I use the money that's coming? Now, let me give you some hints. This is from the Pacific SIDS. We expect that the BIM phase is really going to be trying and testing a few things, not everything. It's probably going to be looking at the gap areas that have been widely acknowledged as gaps when it comes to loss and damage, like non-economic loss and damage. So I would be thinking about activities that are directly related to non-economic impacts. I would also be thinking of some of the slow onset events. We all are very used to cyclones and extreme flooding, but what about these insidious, slow, long-term impacts like sea level rise, like ocean acidification, that are like salinification of groundwater, that are slowly but surely undermining livelihoods. So think about activities to address those. I would also be thinking about some of the kind of prearranged finance ideas. So how can we make sure that the fund gets money quickly without having to go through a big request or proposal process in the midst of, a crisis? So think about how a national system might allow for money to flow in a prearranged way. I think there's going to be a big push by the board to fund requests that are related to small grants, particularly small grants to individuals and communities through civil society. So if you can already start to articulate what that might look like in your developing country context, that would be very strategic. Think also about budget support modalities. It doesn't always mean that it's coming to a national treasury, but maybe there could be a trust fund that's already established or thinking about being established that could receive those monies and then disperse them in various diverse and impactful ways. I would also be thinking about, we heard in the board meeting a lot of members talking about social protection. So what are ways that social protection systems that already exist could be strengthened to address loss and damage? And perhaps the final kind of advice is, the developed country parties love insurance. And so I think it'd be very strategic for developing countries to think about a way to incorporate insurance into this first request to tick the boxes. And it's useful. I mean, there's no doubt that if we can get the right type of insurance that's tailored to our beneficiaries, then it could be a useful response. So these would be some of the things that I would encourage you to start thinking about in your first articulation of request. Now, it may be that your country hasn't even thought about what they would ask money for. I would encourage you to engage with the Santiago Network. If you haven't, if your country hasn't already, and even if you're a civil society member or a private sector, go to your responsible ministry and say, who is your Santiago Network liaison officer? And can you start thinking about a request for technical assistance to help us think through these things? We can also start to establish loss and damage contact points under the WIM and the executive committee of the WIM. Most countries have not yet established these contact points. And this is important for sharing of information, getting access to the latest knowledge and brokering, etc. And of course, as Hafiz and others have mentioned, it's important that we, for the fund itself, we establish a national authority who's going to be essentially saying, this is what our bottom-up country-driven approach is. It would be a travesty if a country selected either an individual or an institution who doesn't have a mandate for or has no capacity to engage with communities and people who are affected. So we need to be identifying and nominating the right either individual or agency that can play this critical role of ensuring that we do have this bottom-up country-led request that comes to the fund. So a lot needs to be done now, and I would not wait until a template or a request for a call for proposals is launched. That needs to have started already, even well before the beginning of this year. So there's a lot for civil society to be doing, a lot for activists to be doing, a lot for our finance experts to be thinking about, and our policy experts to make sure that we do get access to at least this first 250 million disbursement.
Thank you, Christopher. Just before coming to Harjeet, I'll talk a little bit about some of the elements that you mentioned as it resonates with some of the national activities that we've been planning with the ministries here, as well as the Department of Environment. And quite rightly, as you mentioned, that you're waiting for the templates and the calls to come from the board, and then deciding how we'll mobilize and how we get technical assistance is really the old UN way of doing things. I think that COP way is something that does not fit for purpose anymore. So one of the elements that we've been looking at, particularly in as we do this assessment of understanding how loss and damage has been manifesting in these different climatic events. So cyclones being one for Bangladesh in particular, where we know it is a cyclone-prone country, and these flash events will happen. These sort of, rapid onset activities will have loss and damage impacts embedded to them. And we've usually, at the time now, Bangladesh having a very good early warning system on cyclone prevention and sort of rehabilitation from this. We get usually about a week to 10 days of a lead up time, understanding that a storm has been sort of forming in the Bay of Bengal, somewhere in the ocean. And it's timely, and usually about a week or so, we get that sort of lead up understanding where it might be hitting, which districts, which parts of the coastline, as well as what type of impact and severity it might have. And again, with that preliminary information, that might be something that you could mobilize and quickly write a funding proposal to the fund. So a proposal saying that we anticipate this storm to happen. We already know from previous examples that this type of a storm hitting that type of a locality, that district, has had this type of impact. So again, a bare bones assessment, but at least some sort of workable numbers where we can say that certain types of impacts are likely to happen. And is this something that we can quickly send to the fund board saying that we anticipate this level of impacts to be coming? Can we already start talking about within the first week before the storm has hit as anticipatory? We understand that this is going to be something perhaps after the storm comes that the money will come through, but writing that application and that request. And again, what might that look like? And fully understanding that this is as iteration. This is as we start now. These are early examples using past examples of storms, past examples of impacts. But as we get better and do this more refinedly in iterations, you get a much more fine-tuned sort of prediction, and a much more fine-tuned prediction lets you be a bit more anticipatory coming through. So at the start of the season, not only when the storms are coming through. So those might be some of the ways of really thinking about how to use this sort of fund in a fast manner. But as you quite rightly said, there needs to be more national mechanisms sort of built in being able to absorb and withdraw that fund from the international down into the national, into the locals. So with that being said, Harjeet, as you were mentioning quite a lot of the community accesses. So what might be the things that as we look forward to not only the lessons from B5, but the intersessionals coming B6 and then COP later on, what are the homeworks that we should be doing in our communities here? What should we really be preparing for back home right now?
Sure. First of all, agree to everything that has been said, and I would have also covered the same thing. Just to add, this is a time when we have to really invest into systems. And I must tell you, countries like Bangladesh, Nepal, and Malawi are going to be struggling a lot more than SIDS and Pacific nations, where they already have a lot more integrated systems. So I think there's a clear-cut role that we have in developing countries, from LDCs and some of the large developing countries who have to put these systems in place, because there are ministries who are not talking to each other. So really bringing it together, and as Christopher said, in terms of focal point. Second point, which Hafiz briefly touched upon, is the transparency. We need to make sure that every penny that's coming to our system, not only from this fund, but from any corner, any pot, has to be spent well. We need to, increase the confidence level of the international community. And because we as civil society don't want them to use it as an excuse, and we always show them the mirror that, we know the kind of systems you have. So, but at the same time, we need to make sure that money goes to the intended communities and the purpose. So we should not keep our eyes off the international process. There's still a lot happening, but mostly the ball is in our court. And in terms of community, not a disagreement, but to complement what Christopher said. Yes, we need to define what is adaptation, what is humanitarian, what is DRR, but that has to happen at our level, not at the community level. Let's not confuse communities of all these different, jargons and streams of working. For them, it's one life. For them, it's one way of doing things. This is where we need to be very mindful of where we need to define it and where we need to not define it, because we want a very integrated program at the community level. So, Sakib, to respond to your very last point is, when we say community access, we look at community, we always do it, but just to underline, as one holistic experience that they have and how we design that bottom up, then it's our responsibility who are working with communities, we're also dealing with these international systems to delineate certain things more from the accountability perspective and making sure that money comes in and doesn't get double counted. And there are many other things that happen in between. So really making sure that communities are at the center. We design program based on what they need, yet being very clear how we are going to access money and ensure that the system is accountable. Let me stop there.
On that note of accountability and transparency, thank you, Arjit. Those are some really good lessons to come through. And I'll also plug in the question from my colleague in the chat about the funding that has been proposed, the accountability of the donors and the pledges that have said, but perhaps a lot of them are not fulfilling those pledges coming through. So she used the example of the US, which is obviously one that we're all aware of, how it's not going to be fulfilling a lot of the climate pledges that they have put through. But if we expand that a little bit, there are over the last year, if you look at quite a lot of the large global North partners, European partners, European councils that have shifted a lot more, shifted into becoming a little bit more into the right wing, perhaps a lot less climate giving, but more climate skeptic. So with that being said, what can we take forward in sort of really holding these funders accountable? The pledges that they have made, and what should we be doing between now and the next few meetings to really hold them accountable? And I know a number of us need to be leaving. So Harjeet, just before you jump off, one last call to action before you leave us. And thank you so much for taking the time to join.
Okay, 10 seconds. So we as civil society are actually going to ramp up pressure on one, as Christopher was raising, money that has been committed but not reached the system. And then, of course, scaling up to match the scale of needs. So we will be working on that. You will hear from us very soon. We really want to do it in a much more campaigning mode. So watch the space and we will reach out to you soon. And apologies, I need to jump off because I have another meeting.
Thank you so much for taking the time as you did. Hafiz bhai, just before you have to head off as well, I think.
Yeah, just to add few words. That is, of course, we need to ensure our transparency. At the same time, it is also important that developed country parties should need to ensure their transparency in terms of the delivery. They committed, they pledged, they need to deliver. But now we all know the changing political landscape. So we need to be concerned, and I think this is the time civil society can also play a very important role so that they can create pressure to the developed country parties so that they deliver. Thank you. That's what I wanted to say. And of course, the parties are mostly responsible during the negotiation, but civil society also can build our campaign on. Thank you.
Thank you, Hafiz bhai, and we look forward to raising that ambition in the upcoming SBs to come as well. Christopher, maybe some final remarks from the side on raising ambition.
Yeah, look, I want to comment on the narrative that this is about giving charity. I think it is abundantly clear that the resources required to address loss and damage are mandatory, a result of failed obligations to address climate change, essentially. So the whole reason we're here is because certain countries and corporations undertook behaviors which have caused harm. And so that responsibility for paying for loss and damage is an area where I think we're probably going to have to move sooner rather than later, particularly as national circumstances are changing away from aid and giving. As you know, Vanuatu has a case right now at the International Court of Justice, which talks about the consequences of breaching obligations. We don't know what the court will say, but that could be a very valuable pathway into mobilizing finance. And in fact, when we negotiated the governing instrument of the Fund for Responding for Loss and Damage, we made it very clear that there could be a range of sources of finance. And one of those sources could be court-mandated payments of compensation. I do want to address the question here about the US. So the US resigned its seat on the board just before the 5th board meeting. So their seat is currently vacant, not only the board seat, but also the alternate board seat. Both US held seats. But I do have to say one good thing about the US in that they made their pledge and they delivered the money before the administration changed. I think they were anticipating, like all of us, what would be coming. So I do thank the previous administration and the previous board member for making sure that that money, although it was small, it was $17 million, nothing like their capacity to pay or their obligation. At least that money was transferred before the change. So the other countries, and I have no problem naming names, just so everybody knows exactly where we stand. Finland, Italy, and Luxembourg have made pledges and have not even started on a contribution agreement yet. The EU, Australia, and Korea have drafted a contribution agreement, but nowhere near paying it into the trust. So we really need to make sure that those countries who've gained political international points for making a pledge actually are held to account putting the money into the trustee. So I think I will also say that we had this high-level dialogue, the very first one, and I was very disappointed that resource mobilization was not a part of the formal structure of the dialogue. It was all about partnerships and complementarity and coherence. Where was the discussion about where the billions are going to come from? So I think we need to do a lot better than that if we're serious about money and resources for addressing loss and damage. Thanks.
Thank you, Christopher. And absolutely, I think quite a lot of the times as we see, the pledges get quite a lot of the media attention as to what will be coming, but never really has it actually materialized, has it actually been fulfilled. And I think thank you again for reading that list off. And I think in future, maybe that's what we need to be looking at when you actually do transfer. Take a picture with the check, not just the fact that you are going to be making a pledge in a negotiation or in a technical session, but actually that you have delivered, that you have put it into one of these pots, most likely the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, but any of the other pledges as well. A lot of those funding examples are left unfulfilled, and the pledges are just carried forward, as we've seen, and quite a lot of the discussion that we saw in COP29 last year as well was of that, unfulfilled pledges, and how do we sort of fulfill that going forward. So hopefully that's something that we can take on and actually materialize later on this year. So with that being said, I do not see any more questions coming through, but I do thank all our panelists for taking the time and all our audience for sticking us through whatever time zone that you're joining from. I think early morning for some of the ones that I can recognize, and very late night for our panelists. Christopher, thank you so much. It must be 1 a.m., 2 a.m. almost at your time, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us. And we look forward to having these conversations with you going forward. And if for anybody else, please do feel free to reach out to us or any of our panelists should you have any other questions going forward, and happy to take these collaborations going ahead. Thank you so much. With that, we'll end over here.